So the talk today is called Imagining Education Futures Beyond the Human. And as I said, this is based on my dissertation, which was called What Matters in Education Beyond the Human and Learning as Symptotic Story Worlding. And before I begin, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement that I acknowledge that we and I live and work on and around Arizona State University's campuses, which are located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash, and the original inhabitants of these lands still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us. When you fly into Arizona, into the valley, you see the Salt River Project canals that surround the area. And those modern day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhugam, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive. And so we acknowledge that the modern day indigenous nations that descend from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land. And I start with this not because I think I have to or because it's things that people do, but because it compels me to remember that I wouldn't be here if not for these people and this land. And it's a good reminder as I go through the presentation that it would not exist if not for the people who are the caretakers of this land. I also just wanted to say thank you again to the workshop organizers. As I mentioned, I do consider this a very high honor that I was invited. It's been such a great workshop series. So I thank you for the time and the space. I situate my work in many different camps in sustainability education, but the work that I'm presenting today kind of troubles the Western education model. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but you can see some of the work I've done in the past has been about SDG 4, quality education, and this one will be more focused on non-Western perspectives. So the outline for today is I'll explain how I structured the dissertation, which is structured after the 4 phases of compost, and that inspires part of our discussion today in the small groups. I'll situate it within the Anthropocene. I'll share the theoretical contribution that I made, which is called story worlding, and that's the other prompt for discussion today for anyone who'd like to engage with that. And I'll share my nature culture approach to the methodology and engage you in some of the stories in my dissertation, including an abridged version of the final chapter, which was written in speculative fabulation. So to begin, I structured my dissertation like the 4 phases of compost. So in the mesophilic phase, easily degradable compounds begin breaking down and the temperature rises. So things just start to fall apart from the structures that we hold so dear. Thermophilic phase is next, where the temperature rises further and decomposition accelerates and pathogens are killed. So this is when I start to take on binary and hierarchical distinctions. In the cooling phase, the thermophilic organisms, which were active at the higher temperatures, begin to tire and cease activity, causing the temperature to decrease. And so this is where we sit in the discomfort of what it feels like when you're losing the structures that you're used to. And in the maturation phase, the material composition is altered, allowing the data and the readers to narrate different stories and story different worlds. And this is how I opened space for myself to use speculative fabulation in a dissertation that was going through a pretty rigorous review from our graduate college here at ASU. And I situate this work within the Anthropocene. This is not something I need to belabor. I think everyone in this workshop agrees that we are living in a time of crisis and there are cascading crises that we're facing. But my dissertation itself, and I won't go into detail too much, it doesn't necessarily focus on the Anthropocene. It presents other parallel scenes that are happening at the same time, but it acknowledges that one of the ways that we characterize this time period is to call it the Anthropocene. So the questions that guided the inquiry were what matters in education beyond the human, and how can we reimagine education futures beyond anthropocentrism? So we're thinking about how we can look beyond just centering humans as the center of everything. And this is stemming from some of the work that I've done with SDG 4 quality education. And this is how Oren and I met. We've participated in a number of symposia focused on international large-scale assessments and their feasibility and desirability. And so this project kind of says that we are pushing aside other ways of knowing and being if we only focus on literacy and numeracy and an education for economic growth model. So the use of speculative fabulation, for example, is meant to just help us reimagine different possibilities and try and push the boundaries that we set when we only talk about literacy and numeracy. And the big question is, in the Anthropocene, can we live inside a period of time where we center the human and still exceed the human? So I used a nature culture approach for this study, and this was based on a review of literature. And I came to land on nature culture, which is Donna Haraway's word, as well as a common worlds framework. And so these frameworks focus on how children, for example, are interconnected with the more than human world. So they pay attention to how everything is relationally made and how you can't separate nature from culture. So it's not that the humans have the culture and they are separate from and in control over nature. That's not how we see this in a nature culture approach. So instead, we see it as becoming with through our relationality, through our interactions, and that we're situated in these worlds and have these experiences together. So I created a new term from all this literature that I'm calling story worlding. And what I mean by that is that our relationships make stories, and those stories create the worlds that we live in. And so when I gave a similar talk when I was interviewing for the position that I'll be beginning in the fall, I explained that they had 3 candidates left in their consideration, and the stories of each of their virtual visits would decide what world we lived in. Would we live in a world where I had the job or one of the other candidates had a job? And so that's how I explained it, but there are other ways, and we will engage with this idea a little bit later. So the idea of story worlding, it matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. And again, I draw inspiration from Donna Haraway here. So if you're wondering, how is any of this education? This isn't comparative education, it doesn't make sense yet. The way that I'm framing this is that we need to see beyond this distinction between formal and non-formal education, or what happens inside of schools and what happens outside of schools. And we need to see all of it, all of our relations, as creating these worlds that we live in. So I'm framing learning, excuse me, learning as story worlding. I also used a nature culture approach in my methods. And so this was a study that took place in Brazil, and I'll show you where in Brazil in the next slide. But data generation happened over 6 months. It was what I would consider a multi-species, multi-mattered ethnography. So again, if that feels unfamiliar, it wasn't just a study of human culture. It was a study of our relationships with other species, such as bees and flowers and plants, and in this case, coffee, cats and dogs and other species, but also matter, things like blocks that were in the classroom. And so I did participate in classes in a one-room schoolhouse, and I'll show pictures of that as well. And in that schoolhouse, the children were part of the storying, and they knew that it was our study. And so they would draw pictures and we'd put it in a book that was our book. And I'd have walking conversations with them. One of my roles was almost like a childcare provider, where I'd sometimes walk them home from school and we'd talk together. And I have audio and visual recordings, including more than 1,000 photos and videos that I took, or the children took, or the parents took. And then I have reflections and musings and field notes. And I was teaching English there, and it was exhausting, but I was teaching 9 hours of English in response to a community identified need for some English classes. And I just went wherever I was invited. So the youngest participant, human participant, was an 18-month-old toddler, and she would say Venka, and I would go with her and follow her wherever she led. And so that's just kind of how data was generated in this study. And then I did a diffractive analysis, which comes from Barad's work. And so this is reading the data while thinking this post-human kind of theory that I've just sort of told you about, and following the data where it led. And this was uncomfortable because there's not a checklist to know when you're done, or if you've done it right, or what's going on. And so I just sort of sat in that discomfort and followed wherever it led, including to write this speculative fabulation story. So I drew inspiration from Donna Haraway and other science fiction and speculative fabulation authors, and I rewrote the data using speculative fabulation. And for anyone who doesn't know, a fable is a story that usually has like a non-human protagonist, maybe an animal, and there's some sort of lesson learned in that story. So this is speculating about other education futures beyond the human. So my study was in southeastern Brazil, in 2 states in southeastern Brazil, and it took place in 2 phases in 2 winters in Brazil, because I was the recipient of a global development research scholarship from ASU, and actually, in a beautiful story, from the school that's hired me as an assistant professor. So I get to pay it forward to thank them for that. And it was over the course of 6 months. And the one-room schoolhouse, this is a picture of the outside and the inside. It was a multi-grade schoolhouse, and it served, there was a chef and a teacher, and the daughter of the chef was too young for the school, but she was a preschooler in the back of the class, and there were 2 other preschoolers. And then there were children from the ages of 8 to 11 in the school as well. And so I spent time in the back of the class, mostly sitting with the preschoolers, but helping out wherever I could and just being with them in the class and storying together. But most of the study happened outside of the school. And I think Oren may remember that I told a story about a bat entering the classroom, and now you can see there's no division between the outside world and the inside world here for this school. This is just open, and anything can fly in that can fit through. So it's a good reminder when we're thinking about sustainability that we don't have to necessarily think about the most advanced techno fixes and having the most technologically advanced school, that sometimes looking at other models can help us remember that we're always already in nature. So the dissertation begins with a memory of my first memory, which is when I was 18 months old and I was looking for my mom, and she wasn't where I thought she was, but in the process I stepped on a wasp's nest and I was stung 10 times, and I screamed, "Daddy, bugs, bugs," and my dad, who's allergic to bees, had to pick me up and take me inside. And so that was my first memory of a winged storyteller. And so now we're entering the stories through the visual data from the dissertation. And so the way that I did this was not a thematic coding, but rather a series of entry points. So this one is the forest, and this is where I lived. I lived in this area that was a reforested bit of land. I had a host who owned a bed and breakfast, and I would walk through this forest every day to the one cobblestone road that led to the school. And as I would walk on the road, I'd encounter things like this sign that says "Danger, slow down." And it was as if the forest was kind of coming out to warn us. It was almost as if the forest was telling us to slow down our destruction. And this was not a quiet place. These birds are very loud. If you've ever heard of jacu, these are the birds that eat the most delicious coffee beans or coffee fruit. And the poop is cultivated for a very expensive coffee. And these birds have this guttural squeak that is just, it sounds like it's tearing through the air. And this is how I woke up every day, was to the sound of these birds. And I would pay attention to the rain. And one of the elder participants in the study told me a story that her grandmother told her about how the ants climb the door frames when the rain is coming. And I didn't believe her. And she told me that rain was coming, and I didn't believe her. And 3 days later, sure enough, it did rain. And when I left, the rain continued, and it destroyed part of the road that I would walk on every day. And they would burn trash or forest to clear land in this area. So we were always sucking down smoke in the school. And one of the 10-year-old participants asked if he could take the camera to take a picture of the destruction of the environment. And the children liked to take pictures of what they called interesting, which included cats and chickens. And days later, this cat was killed by a snake. And this dog had a very scary bite. And one of the children on one of our walks told me, "Don't worry, dogs who bark don't bite." But this dog did bite. He bit me. And the other picture here is a blurry photo of a dog who was chewing on some kind of skull that looked like a boar skull. And I thought it was so interesting. And I wanted to take a picture to send to my friend Esther, who's a biologist, and ask her, "What is this?" And the dog didn't want me getting near her. So she ran off, and this was all I could capture. And one time I was walking with one of the children, and he said, "A spirit lives there." And I said, "Oh, have you ever seen a spirit?" And he said, "No." And I kind of questioned how he knew that a spirit lived where we were. And he just said, "I think they come out at night," and that's all. But I didn't believe him. And they show a picture of their family rooster, which was also killed by a wildcat days later. And when this happened, one of the elders in this community said, "Aren't you not supposed to take pictures of creatures?" "No, that's just superstition," was how he said it. And the children played with blocks, but they weren't always blocks. Sometimes they became a tree house, like on the left, or a corral for the bulls, like on the right. And in one case, after the wildcat had come to kill the rooster, a child put a block in his hand and he called it a vira bicho, so turn animal, turn creature. And he spun around and he was a cat. And one day I came to the school and they said, "There's a bat in the bathroom, there's a bat in the bathroom." And I came inside and there was a bat and they named him Batman and they wanted to take pictures of him. And the next day, one of the children came and he wore his Batman mask. And I wrote a story with the children. We would draw together and I wrote this speculative story, imagining a mixed creature that was half moth and half butterfly. And this is where the inspiration for the speculative fabulation story began. And I won't read it because we are running low on time, but if you want to take a screenshot, I'll just pause for a second. And then I lived in many different worlds in this time. So in this picture, it looks rather idyllic, but if you apply the rule of thirds, in the top half, you see this beautiful blue sky. In the middle, you can see invasive eucalyptus trees. And on the bottom, there's a building that just does not seem to belong. And the story behind this building is that the man that lives on this property is afraid of people. And so the building is covered in hate speech and racist propaganda. And the community had to work for a long time to paint over it with this spray paint to try and camouflage the hate speech and cover it up. And I include this because part of the theoretical approach is to acknowledge that it's all the same kind of oppression. So racism is, or racial justice is climate justice, and gender justice is climate justice. And so having these hidden racial racist propaganda here reminds us of that as well. And it reminds us that we can be living simultaneously in multiple worlds, one that's beautiful and one that's full of hate. And so with all of these stories, I started to break them down and ask questions like, and if the forest is where the story begins, and if the birds calling across the valley are warning of danger, and if the sound waves of all the noise are disrupting the stardust, and if the rain is in response to the rampant fires, and if the children can see what adults cannot, and if the winged creatures are pleading for us to change through the spirits and trees and animals and children. And one day a butterfly had landed on that wall of hate speech, and I thought, what does she think of us? So she became the protagonist of the speculative fabulation. So if this butterfly that landed on the painted wall that day were Orla, a winged storyteller, and if. And so now I'll conclude with just a quick version of my final chapter, which is written in speculative fabulation. And here it goes. So Orla awoke in the story that her ancestors had created for her. And the first thing she did was to create a flower where she could rest. Winged storytellers had evolved to know that they could lengthen the time that their stories existed by creating ways to protect themselves from being discovered. So they created places to hide through the stardust that created the fabric of the story. So she created this flower as a safe place to stay and then set off onto her journey. She flew up into the Valley of the Sun and monitored everything, including the birds and the cows and everything in this area. And she was satisfied that all was well and returned to her flower. The next day, she was flying through the story and she was alerted by the sound of a winged storyteller from above. And something was not right in this story. So she flew on through the valley and came across a fire. And she saw that there was a fire starter standing near where the fire had begun. And she knew she needed to plead with this fire starter to end the destruction, but she didn't know how. She had, in the fabric of her wings, understood that she could communicate with the stardust of the story, but she couldn't communicate directly to the fire starter. So she had to send a message another way. So she went and landed on the leaves of a tree and she sprinkled some of the stardust from her wings onto the leaves. And the leaves fell and the ants understood that the rains were coming and they climbed to higher ground. And as the rains fell, the fires continued. So she decided she needed to try another way. And she had seen a small fire starter and she knew that he didn't have wings, but she could try and communicate to him another way. So she sprinkled stardust onto his eyelashes And that night he was visited by one of his ancestors. And when he tried to tell the story to a fire starter, she didn't believe him, and the fires continued. And so she saw that the fire starters had their own winged storytellers. And so she sprinkled some of the stardust of her wings onto its wings. And as she did this, she realized that she was hastening the end of her story. When she gave away her stardust, she was giving away time in this story. And so with this storyteller, one of the fire starters used a device to capture an image of it, and she felt a searing pain in her wings, and she didn't understand why. And so she pleaded with her ancestors to intervene, and they did. And a dog came, and they sent a wildcat to kill the chicken, and a dog came and ate the bones. And the next day, when the fire starter tried to take a picture again of the dog, she felt a searing pain in her wings, and she knew she had to intervene somehow, but she didn't know how. And it was as if the dog had understood, and he bit the fire starter. But this warning wasn't enough, and the fires continued. And so that night, when the fire starter returned, she tried to take a photo again, but this time the ancestors intervened to take the dog away and blur the image so that she could no longer hurt Orla. But the fire starter wasn't discouraged. She applied a binary overlay, hoping to see the image better, and it didn't work, and she wasn't able to see. And the fires continued. And as Orla tried and tried to plead with everyone, it didn't work. And one day she was tired and she rested on this wall. And when she did, it singed the pads of her feet and it dried her body, hastening the end of her story. And as the fire starter was walking by to capture one last image in this story, Orla dried and faded into the fabric of her ancestors and into the stories that would never be told. So that's the end of the presentation portion. I do want to just say thank you for the space to share this story. I know it can sometimes feel different or confusing about how this might be education. So what I'd like us to do is engage in a discussion, and I'll share this quickly and then stop sharing my screen, and then we can talk a little bit more. So the discussion that I'd imagined for us today is very open-ended. And so I'd like us to engage with the two concepts that I presented that might have been newer to you. So one is story worlding, and the other is composting. And I don't have any set expectations. If you spend the whole time with your groups unpacking what you've heard today, that's fine. But if you'd like to share a story with the group about a relationship or an experience that made the world that you or we live in today, I think that would be a good use of our time to just try and reflect on maybe it was a relationship with a dog or a person or anything that you'd like to share. Then that is us enacting story worlding as an activity. If that doesn't feel as accessible, there's at the bottom things that you can talk about, like what relationships contributed to who you are today, or you can think about a specific educational phenomenon and then talk about how did it come to be what it is today. So how did we come to be in this situation where we're looking for solutions, trying to quickly respond to climate change after decades of already trying to do that thing. And then the other option, or as a continuation, is to engage with composting. And so this is a metaphor that you can apply to breaking down a tough problem, because sometimes it's not possible just to completely blow up the whole model and not be able to use it anymore, right? So you can engage in breaking down an educational problem or phenomenon using those 4 phases and just talk about how that metaphor might apply to one of the most troubling or pressing educational phenomena. And so with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll share a link to this document so that you have it. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Janna. I suggest we actually, before we start the small group discussions, why don't we open for some questions and answers?
That'd be great.
Comments. I think we have enough time because you are so good. So let's take 10 minutes.
Sure, that would be great.
To open a space for a couple of questions. If you can raise your hand virtually, I'll call you so we can have some order in the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for the kind comments. Very nice.
Daphne, go ahead. I see a question.
No, I saw Danny raise his hand.
Oh.
I think Danny was clapping.
Oh, there's another hand.
Yeah, I see Bharti Chibel. Go ahead, please.
Congratulations to the organizers, both Oren and Daphne, for that excellent session today. And of course, to Janna for that wonderful presentation. Very briefly, well, I'm a professor in the University of Delhi here in India, and working on education, environmental issues, and culture for almost 2 decades. And I found quite many similarities in your presentation, Janna, and what I've been working on. So I have, because I have been working on transcultural aspects and education environment, like in India, we have these folk tales and all, and also traditional knowledge on which I have been working related to how to make it more, people more aware about it, and actually how we can incorporate all this knowledge in the modern system so that we can work towards climate action. So this is something that I've been working on. Now, Janna, I just have two quick related questions. One, you mentioned that there were some young children and some little older children. So what was the rough age group of your students? And second, this is very interesting about story building. I mean, this is a very interesting model. And here in India, we have been working on this for quite many years, and especially with our new education policy, we have actually brought it back to our education system. And since I was one member of this new education policy, so I'm quite aware of its importance. So when you because it's very important to it's very important to inculcate these habits very young in the children, and the whole process of socialization towards climate action or environmental issues. So after your course or the story building session, did you find any change in students being more aware, more conscious about climate change or environment, or did they ever express, that okay, they will be doing this for the climate action? So your take on that.
These are great questions. Thank you for that. And I'm very happy to say that one of my friends, Anu Sachdev here, Dr. Anu Sachdev, she's one of my friends from India, and we are working on combining our dissertations and coming up with a different way of seeing this nature culture approach. So we did similar dissertations with children in early childhood spaces and following the children where they lead and seeing what they draw and paying attention to what they share and what their worlds look like. And so she and I are working together on something similar, trying to include this sort of beyond human approach that has already existed for a very long time. So to answer your first question, the children that participated in the study ranged from 18 months and within the school up to 11 years, but within the study, it was teenagers and adults. So I had 4 generations, I think, of participants, or 3 generations of participants in the study. I count the multi-species participants as other generations. So there were, plants, and these plantations had been in these families for generations. So this was the 5th generation of coffee producers. But the children were from 18 months to 18 years, and then there were adults as well. And then the second question about any kind of changes, there was no intervention in this study. There was no before and after. What I was doing was following the children to attune myself to what their worlds are, and not saying that they're separate from our worlds, but to how they are interrelated with the more than human world, with their blocks and with everything, the bats and the cats and everything. And what I think that shows us is that in this modern education model, we somehow unlearn this connectedness to nature that's already there. And so with the children, I would just follow wherever they led. And so one of the stories I didn't include in this was the youngest human participant was the 18-month-old toddler. And after the wildcat came and killed all of the chickens, she was very concerned, and she said, "Come here." And we walked around to the different houses of her family's plantation to check all the chicken coops to make sure that there weren't any that were just there and were injured. She wanted to check on all the chickens, and she wanted to go to her aunt's house and check on all the chickens. And so we walked around together, and I just followed her wherever she led. And that's what that showed me. And it was really sweet. So at the time that we were having this walk, the wildcat came back. And so this was a very mountainous area. And so one of her cousins lived above a hill from her, and she could see the mountain cat and the cousins on the swing, and she's screaming. And the 18-month-old child said, be careful, my child. She screamed up to her, be careful, my child. And I just thought it was so endearing and sweet. And so these interconnections between family, but also with the more than human world, they're already there. And so I was a participant in them. And in other research terms, we might say an observer of them, but I was very much a part of them. And so it wasn't as if they learned something from me that then they went on to be more aware. It was that I was paying attention to the awareness that was already there and trying to reconcile that awareness with a Western education model that I was raised in and that I've been studying for these years, and trying to see how I unlearned my own connectedness with the more than human world. And I think we all have, and even some of our creativity and things like that seem to get taught out of us over time. So I think that's how I would answer the question. The other thing is, one of the youngest participants in the school, she was 3 years old, so she wasn't yet enrolled in the preschool part of the multi-room or multi-grade schoolhouse. But she was drawing a picture, and I show this in other presentations, so I didn't include it here, but it was of some trees that seemed to be falling, and then there was kind of a floating figure, and she told me it was a picture of the bad lady taking the trees. So this 3-year-old was aware of how they were using fire to clear land or of deforestation. So that came through in the drawings that she made, and other children made drawings about the world that they lived in and the world that they imagined. And in the world that they lived in, they saw trash in the river and fires and the school bus sending, they only had the one school bus, but they called it out for polluting the air. And so the world that they imagine, people are putting trash in the trash can and respecting the river and all of that. So it's already there. And I was just kind of participating in it, not really teaching or intervening in any way, just following where I was invited. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Janna. I mean, you're doing excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Vikash, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Janna. Very wonderful. So it's my first time to just listen this kind of story worlding. So it's like very much interesting. Just I saw your spirit slides, and as you just questioned the thing, like, so what's there? It's a spirit, and you said, like, have you seen it? So, so it's right. So here in India, particularly, we have a spirituals, and as you just explained, like the people are polluting the river. So we have here the rivers, and the name of the rivers are on gods. So we have Ganga river, and Ganga is a god, and there are many other rivers which the name so their names are on the name of God, but still the people are polluting them on the name of God. So what their thought process is, they said whatever good and whatever bad it is, but it's created by God. Okay, so from the concept of God, they pollute and they destroy the nature. So what do you think about it, and how we can teach, or how we can engage student to just think about the concept of gods, and what are the different irrational things going behind the concept of God? So what do you think about it? Like how we make our student rational in that sense? Yeah, thank you.
Really interesting question. I really appreciate you sharing that example about the river and being named after a god, because it's something that we can relate to and understand. And it reminds me of how in other places they assign human rights to rivers to protect them. And that's always, I think that the rivers need to be protected, but that's always troubled me, because it's as if we have to first assign a godlike ability, to nature to protect it, so that we will be compelled to protect it, or a human right to nature so that we will be compelled to protect it. So with my work, I try and say that we're not separate from the river at all. We are the river. If you think about how much water we're made of, or all the bacteria that lives in our guts or anything like that. So part of it is stopping this narrative that we're somehow disconnected from the river and then in control over it so that we can pollute it in the name of God, And so I think that's really interesting. Religion did come up in this study. They're Catholic participants, and they told one of the oldest participants in the study, one of the elder, like the patriarchs of one of the families, told me that they used to burn land a lot more, that they would just set fire and let it burn. And it was the Catholic Church that came and told them not to do that. And so it was really interesting to me that they were still burning land when he's telling me this story, but he was telling me that it was the church that came and told him not to burn land. So I went to church with them and I participated with them and just tried to be a part of it all. But I think part of it is just at least in the Western education model, and I'm not as familiar with other models. This is the one that I kind of work in and disrupt. So in the Western education model, we are separate from nature. And I think, naming something after a god might not mean that it then gets more respect. I'm not sure that would happen. But I think part of it is realizing that it's all connected. So your spirituality is connected. If you're related to the land, that's connected. And so not separating yourself from that is important, which is why I have the story worlding prompt for y'all today, because I thought you can reflect on how you came to be with this world in any way. So it could be through your religion, and you could tell a story about how your own religion has helped you understand your interconnectedness to nature and the more than human world. So I really appreciate you bringing up that topic and asking that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you, Janna, for the responses. I think it's time for some small group activities. So Janna, if you can share with us the link in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Just 1 second. So I have two versions. That one is just the straight PDF and you can scroll through it or download it. And then the other is on Canva in case you just want to click from one to the next. It does not make a difference, but it's just your comfort. So there's the prompt. And again, I have no expectations that you must engage with any of these things. I just am eager to hear if anyone does share stories, if you want to share them in a larger group later, or if you do break down some sort of educational phenomenon using the metaphor of compost. Love to hear which one it was and how you broke it down. So I hope you enjoy chatting with each other.
Great. Okay, so we have 18 minutes to continue our conversation based on the small group discussion. And I invite people to comment, share with the whole group. You can raise your blue hand and I will call you to participate. Silence is another way to spend the morning together. I'm all about that, but let's use the time. So please, Gareth, go ahead.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Yeah, just a really quick comment that I thought this was a wonderful reminder, and I was saying this in the breakout group, that I thought this was a wonderful reminder that thinking that how education, especially schooling, can be too functional, that that the adults that shape education, I think it's really important that we perhaps should be using our imaginations more. I thought just say that was a wonderful reminder about that.
Thank you. We had a similar conversation in our small breakout groups talking about imagination and taking a moon journey, an imaginative moon journey together. It was really fun. I'm just so curious about how it went. Does anyone want to share? I mean, we had a wonderful discussion and I'm just dying to know what you even talked about in your small groups.
Could we have the metaphor, the compost metaphor on the screen? Yeah. Well, in the discussion room, I began with that, but when it is your words I'm questioning now. The education system, the problem is something which can be observed. You know why you need the change. what easily breaks down when you examine it further, you know that you have already broken. It has been made, that's okay, it can be observed. Now you have some persistent elements and you see them. They block you, they fight with you, they are here. And you cannot move them, they are part of human life or something. So, very interestingly, you leave the terms, you don't use anymore a term which is linked to observation, but you say imagination. How do you imagine? The tomato that the compost, you can imagine him, but you never did, you never made it. Oh, and this is probably like in any educational change, because the persistent elements are not, you cannot break them down. They are here, they stay. They interfere with your work, and you must go around or go above or deal with it or cope with them or make some coalition and agreement, I don't know, but you cannot break them down. They are here, and they are the reason why people did not use your system before. Use systems you went to change because of these persistent elements. So the main problem is here. Otherwise, it's a very, I told them we are enchanted by your presentation, but skeptic because of the persistent elements.
I would love to address that. That is such a good point. So compost maintains 50% of its original composition. And so the reason that I chose composting, it was inspired by literature and women I had read, but the reason I chose composting is because we don't have the luxury of just completely replacing the system. It's never going to happen. We are never going, in our lifetimes, we will still be talking about the same things across our career because they're persistent and durable status quo that we are just dealing with. So compost to me is a beautiful metaphor for that because it still breaks down some of those things, some of those pathogens, and it becomes something more productive, but it maintains 50% of its original composition anyway. And so then when you think about it with this idea that we're all made of stardust and that everything, all matter comes from stardust, ancient stardust, then it helps you to imagine even further. And so I combine it with the story worlding because those are relationships. And so these are systems built on relationships. And if everything here is relation. Oh, so that's why I think the compost is a good metaphor to just imagine, like you said. So I understand your skepticism and I'm not surprised that it is frustrating that we don't have a solution. We're just trying to make the best of what we have. And so this is one way to try and break down a system that's not working as a metaphor, just as a thought exercise to try and figure out, well, what if we use our imaginations a little bit more, does it help us see something we haven't seen yet? Or does it help us access something we haven't used in a while? So thank you for bringing that up, that it doesn't all the way break things down, that those things don't go away, because they don't and they won't in our lifetimes. And so it's a good thought exercise, at least, to think it through.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw another person that wanted to participate. No.
Or I'm happy to share something.
Please.
Yeah. So something that we were talking about in our breakout room, which I really thought was quite fascinating, we shifted over to the urban landscape and thinking about learners who are in urban places and what their relationship with nature is. And I think what we landed on is that sometimes I think that the stories that exist when it comes to nature in urban landscapes are one of destruction and also irreparable damage. And we begin to wonder, like, well, what are the emotional connections to those stories of learners where it is only destruction and maybe we can't do anything about it? And I also think too, coupling that with young people today and their close connection of social justice and activism to their identities, and when those stories are embedded there, like how it may shut down a part of the sense of self and belonging when nature is irreparably damaged where they live. And perhaps their sense of ownership of like, well, what is really mine when it comes to nature? And is a park, which is a collective good, or mine is my apartment and just these four walls that I live in, rather than a sense of place and land. And students that I worked with in Rwanda, they were very proud of the fact that that their land was theirs and passed down from generations and family, which is probably similar to the students that you worked with, Janna. So it was just very interesting talking about these emotional connections to stories and how pride and also sadness can be associated with it. And then even thinking about that and engagement with those stories. Like, do I even want to engage with that story if it's so sad and frustrating and something that had no agency to change when it happened, the destruction where urban cities are now. So it was just pretty interesting talking about these kind of meta connections to stories.
I really appreciate you sharing that too. We had a similar conversation about, well, how can I connect to nature in New York? And we also talked about how nature's not just the pretty things, it's the trash too, and the noise and all of that. So I had in my dissertation that this wasn't a quiet place, and New York City is not a quiet place either. And so we talked about how culture is part of this too, and music, and there's this cultural connectedness. And so it doesn't, so because we are already nature, connectedness to your family and ancestors is part of it too, you know. So even if you see yourself in four walls or in an urban space where you don't see water, green spaces, anything like that, you're still connected to something, and all of this is interconnected. So the world itself is relationally made, and I love that you engaged with that, and especially given your context in New York and everything. So thanks for sharing. Anyone else have stories to share?
I can share a story, Oren, you won't love it, but I will share it with everyone. So in our small group, I tell my partners what you wrote me during Janna's talk. So I will not say what you wrote me.
It was all compliment. I was in the moment of frustration, trying to understand. Okay.
Wait, but what it did to our conversation. So we talked a lot about the methodology. If this is a rigorous methodology, and if we should use it, how we should use it and who decide what is a good methodology or not. So who has the power to decide? And I shared about an article that I wrote using drawings, which the reviewers are killing me. And I wonder if I will add to this your storytelling and stuff like this. So probably the editor will kick it before giving it to the reviewers. So it was very interesting to think about how we decide what is a good methodology and what is rigorous. And so
I think that, so I'm so sorry that your review was not good because you had drawings. That's not right, and it shouldn't be. And so I think it's how we choose where we send this work too. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so honored that you and Oren and Erica and everyone made this possible, because this workshop itself has been a trendsetter for this year. I mean, you're changing virtual engagement, the conference model altogether, and just to have you see value in this work, to share it, it meant a lot to me. But I think that, you know, it's who makes decisions. And so if you're sending it to certain journals and you know it's not a good match for them methodologically, well, then they're going to tell you it's not a good methodologically. But these worlds exist, and people do this work all over the world. And so if there's just one gold standard, then yes, this might not be that gold standard. But I am so thrilled that it was funded twice by USAID and First Solar, and that there was so much love that so many people put into it for it to be possible, and been invited to submit it as a book manuscript. And, you know, it's like that we're making space for these things. And I acknowledge all these women that came before me that did it too. You know, my mentor, Iveta Silva, does work like this, and she made me feel safe that I could, that this was okay, that this is good. And I think the metaphor of compost resonates with people. And just engaging with stories is always accessible. And so I think it's making your space where you need it. And if someone's telling you it's not a valid methodology, well, then that's not where it belongs anyway, because they don't value it. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Can I just piggyback on Daphne? So one of the exchange that we had with Daphne during the talk is, how do you write something like this? Because I can totally see the audiobook and I can see the video, right? The presentation has so many more layers to it. How do you then take it and put it in a text that can be 9,000 words, or if it's a book, 200,000 words? That's the thing that we were talking about. Like, how do you do that beyond this presentation? If you can give us a little bit of tips about that, I think for everybody that would be very useful.
Absolutely. This took a long time and it was uncomfortable. So I had been imagining the idea that the butterfly wings could create worlds. So it was kind of like that butterfly effect if a wing could create a change somewhere, right? So the first time I had that inkling was in October of 2019, and it was at the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Conference, and I shared it with a colleague, Andrew Gibbons. And I said, I just felt so scared to say it out loud. And he said, that's a beautiful contribution and you should, it'll help the field. You should write it. And so it was like, that was 2 years ago. And I've just been imagining it, you know, this whole time when I'm driving, when I was volunteering at the animal shelter, when I was swimming in my parents' pool in Phoenix and looking up at a tree, and the deprivation of sound made me realize that that was such a loud place that I was in, and this was a quiet place. And so it was like a year in the making for writing it. But that said, one of the reasons I'm thrilled about my new job is that the tenure and promotion bylaws do value things like documentaries. And so I've made a couple of videos. I'll try and grab the links really quickly, or maybe if there's a follow-up email, but I've made videos about this. So I had a CIES presentation for the virtual CIES in 2020. I made 2 videos as reporting for the grants that I earned for this work. And those include things like poetry. One of the teenagers wrote this beautiful poem, and that's in there, and it's her voice reading her poem, and I credit her with her name, you know. And so these are things that aren't always included in research methodologies that are more restrictive. And so I do think that Oren, you're right on that it can't always just be a book, that it has to be visual. In my dissertation defense, I included the sound of the jacu, the very loud bird, as a part of the slide, but I was worried about the animation of it and didn't want it to go wrong. And so having soundscapes and podcasts or videos or documentaries or something, I think is very important, and expanding what is rigorous and valuable to include visual methods like that, I think is important as well. But I'll try and share these links to the videos in case anyone wants to hear the teenager's poem or see more, like the story about the older gentleman. You'll hear his voice telling me that we were burning the land. We used to set it to fire. And so I'll send those to everybody.
If you can send me and Daphne links to all of these materials, we can just post it on the website so people can use it as they view the recording.
That'd be great.
I mean, Erica will do that. I don't know how to do this kind of stuff.
Erica's brilliant. Thank you, Erica, for everything. Seriously, thank you.
We have time for one more comment before we adjourn.
Well, I'll make the final comment. I just wanted to thank everybody. So I see some really sweet messages here in the chat. Thank you for those. And I'll definitely share contact information and all of that. But I just, especially to friends that I invited who came and people who've never heard of this before and stayed, I really appreciate you engaging and sharing your stories. And I hope that we can stay in touch and continue the story worlding together. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Oren and Daphne and Erica. I really do appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Janna, for a wonderful session, and thank you everybody for participating. We are going to meet one more time for this year, and the presenter is going to be Erica Kessler. Hi, Erica, you can wave so everybody can see you. And Erica is going to talk about a topic that came again and again today in small groups and last time on climate change and youth. So I hope everybody can join us. We will send out information. Thank you, everybody, and see you in July.